This is part 2 to the Kandinsky first test review. So in this one I'm going to talk to you about color and the meaning of the color and how Kandinsky handled color. In the previous discussion I talked about how Kandinsky invents this new language of abstract color. So we made a list of the feelings and moods of color. Now you have to be careful of the contents and the context. Like, are you using the right meaning of the color in this case? An example would be that if something is symbolic and you have to use the right context, the black cat in Romare Bearden's Rocket to the Moon, in the context of the civil rights movement, it's the Black Panthers. So you have to be careful on your interpretations here that they are accurately applied. So we know that, for instance, yellow can either indicate happiness or anxiety, and red can denote, say, love or anger or passions. But red also might be associated with some other things, like, blue is the Virgin Mary. So we'll come back to that one. The blue in the center is meant to refer to the homeland of Russia, because Kandinsky's Russian. And so this sense of blue being about loyalty and trustworthiness, a true blue friend. So he's loyal to his homeland, even though things might be kind of confusing in the government at the time. In the upper right-hand corner, we see a green stroke that looks like it could be an outline of a woman. And that is, in fact, the queen, or in this case, Tsarina Alexandra. Tsar Nicholas was the king at the time, and he stands next to her in purple. So purple is royalty. That's how come I know it's the king and queen. Purple for royalty for him, and the figure looks like it has a crown on top of its head. And then green for the queen, because she's supposed to produce an heir. When I say the word Tsar and Tsarina, if you're forgotten your basic history, Tsar is either T-S-A-R or C-Z-A-R. It's Russian, so it's being translated, so Tsar could be, either spelling. Tsarina is either T-S-A-R-I-N-A or C-Z-A-R-I-N-A. So that's Nicholas and Alexandra, and that's going to be important later on. You can also see that on one side of the painting, the colors are more muted, and the other side of the painting, they're more bright. Now, when you're looking at this, color is extremely important to Kandinsky. And one of the contexts of this importance is music. Kandinsky was a musician and was really interested in music, and at the time, jazz is just beginning. So this idea in jazz that you might take a little snippet of something and play with it. Boiled Peanuts is a really famous jazz line, and it's da 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 da. And so you might have that little riff go da 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 ba ba or da da ba ba ba, and so playing with the beat of it. So Kandinsky has this really cool idea. In science at the time, they're working also with optics. And they're finding that color isn't something that's in an object. It's just a reflection of light. So, light bounces off an object and goes towards your eyes and goes into your eyes, into your brain, where you have an impression of color. Well, they were studying these wavelengths of light that made color, and they were describing them as wavelengths, and Kandinsky had this really cool idea. Well, music is just vibrations of a certain wavelength that hit your eardrums, and that tympanic membrane, like a drum, right, membrane, will then make you feel a certain way. So when you listen to music and it evokes a feeling, really it's just vibrations on your eardrum. And Kandinsky thought, well, if light is kind of the same thing. I mean, it's the same kind of wavelengths, just light instead of sound. What happens when light wavelengths hit your eye and your eye is responsive to it? I mean, your pupil contracts and expands, right? And so when you have light hitting your eyes, he make music for your eyes? So when he paints color, could it be that these vibrations of color hit your eyes and can make you feel a certain way? Now, you know from the psychology of color that's been developed that, color heavily influences us. Kandinsky's one of the first people to really, really explore this, and he does it musically. So he names this composition 4. This is about the upheaval in Russia before the Russian Revolution. But he's trying to capture the feeling like music captures a feeling. Now, before jazz and before rock and roll, music might have lyrics that would be like, I met my love in a park, she was so beautiful, and her hair was golden in the sun, something like that. And then, jazz comes along, and you have scat and ba-ba-ba-da-ba, and then you have rock and roll, I love you, yeah, yeah, yeah. Now music where somebody might just be like, right? So Kandinsky has this idea that instead of representing civil war, let's say you painted a picture of or photograph the Capitol insurrection, and you just see people maybe screaming or jostling or moving around. Well, all of that had kind of a soundtrack in the news, didn't it? But 100 years from now, if they just see people in a group, jostling around, it doesn't have the feel or the anxiety of what happened when people went into the Capitol. So you might instead have a soundtrack that's like the feeling of conflict, a soundtrack that's the feeling of people clashing. If I had a soundtrack of a war, I might go like, boom, boom, there's the cannons, and clip, clip, clop, here's the horses, and it's too literal of a soundtrack. We're used to now soundtracks kind of being more abstract and making you feel a certain way, building tension. So Kandinsky is doing that idea for the first time in a painting. So when we look at the colors, we can think of color and music. And in fact, in music, they often say, the color of somebody's voice, the color of a note. So there's a deep blue note in the center of the painting, where the mountain is, the homeland. When you have a deep blue note in jazz, just imagine what kind of instrument that might be, or what a deep blue note might sound like. And then I see those 3 red dots. Beep, beep, beep. I know it's funny when I make the sounds, but it makes it more interesting. Those red hats are actually, they're not chickens, they're Bolsheviks, Bolshevik. The Bolsheviks are before the communists come into Russia, and they're a political group that is angry about how the Tsar and Tsarina are building up the military and building up their wealth. I'll talk about in a bit. But they're kind of like the Oath Keepers or the 3%ers or the Proud Boys. I wouldn't say with the white supremacist stuff, but definitely that kind of militant citizen rising up feel. So they're 3 red hats, and Kandinsky musically shows them as these 3 angry dots. There are 2 figures on the right lower corner. Now, it might look like a pathway going from the blue mountains to this pathway or road to the right-hand corner, lower corner. If you look, those are actually 2 bodies that are snuggling or spooning, and Kandinsky called them the lovers. And they're the people who are laying back, pulling back, kind of like us quarantining at home. Obviously, COVID wasn't going on at the time. I'm just using that as a metaphor. But they're at home, and they're kind of anxiously watching what's going on in the country. And they're spooning or cuddling, trying to kind of pull back and find comfort. But they're anxiously watching what's going on. And so that yellow is not that they're happy. The yellow is that they're anxious and worried. And the red might be that there's a little bit of anger, or the red might be that they love their country but are anxious about where it's going. And so you see that red, love, passion, and then you see the blue, again, loyalty, or, trying to trust what's going on. When you put these colors together, they're intended to form a musical composition. Now, there is the color black, right? And the black is all in lines. Imagine those black lines as a drum beat, and each line is a literal, I'm talking about a beat. And if you were to drum out the kinds of lines that you see, you would get a kind of rhythm. And where the lines go diagonal, you might do a slide on the beat, like a boom, boom. Or where they are very sharp, bop, 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 bop. And so Kandinsky is using the black lines as the beat, and then using the hues or the colors as the notes on it. Now, when he calls this composition 4, okay, it's a musical score. You could actually play this painting if you could figure it out. Give each color a different instrument, or synthesize it with different beats that are going on digitally. So when you have a composition in music, the notes aren't just random, right? They flow and go together. So it's important in this piece to see which color comes first and what the beginning of the, quote, visual music looks like, how the visual music builds, and then at the end, what color is next to what. Now, this gets into semiotics, right? The meanings we get from the colors and the associations we get from the color. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the semiotics now, the meanings of the pieces. When I describe these colors, they are abstract, but they are also attached to symbols. For example, the green is attached to the queen, the purple is attached to the king, the blue is attached to the homeland. So I'm only going to talk about the major symbols. You may see little symbols in this piece, but what you might see at first from the left-hand side is you go down a hill and you hit a rainbow that seems pretty bright with a setting sun underneath it. So we know from Audrey Flack's Wheel of Fortune, there was a rainbow in the big mirror, and that meant hope, like hope for the afterlife. Well, with a sinking sun, hope is failing. Hope is sinking in this case. You then go up and you see the horse that I can see and you may or may not see, and it seems to be kind of dramatic in black and white. And then just behind the two vertical lines that are dividing the picture, there is a shape that looks like a house or a castle on the hill. Now, we saw in Albrecht Dürer's Night, Death, and the Devil both a horse and a castle on the hill. Now, in this case, it does not mean heaven. It's a kingdom. It's a symbol of a literally kingdom. And we know that because of the semiotics of that house being directly across from the Tsar, king, and Tsarina. Now, the house is empty. The castle is empty, as though the king and queen have abdicated or left. And you can see that the king and queen in the upper right-hand corner are distant from the castle. They've left the castle. They've abdicated on their responsibilities. They're kind of out there watching from a distance, but they don't seem to be pretty active in this scene. You then go, down, and you see the couple spooning, right? Well, look at how close or far apart things are, because metonymic codes happen when you put two things together. Remember the metonymic code photographs that you made, where you took one picture and by putting it together with different images, it had different meanings? Okay, the horse, out of control power, is facing away from the castle, meaning there's some kind of rebellion where people are turning away from the government, turning away from the kingdom, from the king's residence. So the horse is turned away from the castle, but the horse's tail is touching the castle. So that makes me think, okay, this power turning away from the king, turning away from what the government's doing, this is crazy power rising up, and they're turning away from this castle because the castle is empty. Nobody's there doing anything. And I also noticed the semiotics of the castle and the king and queen, where there's distance. So that means that the king and queen are not paying attention. They're off somewhere and very distant. I can see different connections in images and color. For example, behind the king's head, where the crown is the sun. And, you have the Sun King, Louis XIV, but you have halos around kings. Kings are like the son of another king. So this idea of the sun kind of being reflected on the king might make some connections. The sun going down underneath the rainbow is a semiotic metonymic code. I could say that this is a very condensed code. Condensed codes are when you have a whole lot of meanings really, really connected. And so there may be a condensed code for music, like visual music. This color sounds like this color sounds like that. There might be a condensed code of icons and symbols, what they mean. There might be a historically condensed code. I will concede that there might be a displaced code. If you don't know about art, and you didn't live at this time, and you don't know about the Tsar and Tsarina, you're not going to really understand this painting. So it could be that you could say, there's some displaced code here. However, I think that's just because we haven't really thoroughly explained this painting. Now, I've spoken about color and its meaning. I've talked about semiotics and connections with the symbols. I talked about music. I talked about the Tsar and Tsarina. So there's multiple concepts here. So I took the content of the color, put in the context of, the field of psychology is going on. Science is looking at optics and color. The context is Kandinsky's a musician. He's interested in jazz. So there's a bunch of context here. And then the concepts are, color can be thought about like music. The idea that you can have a painting that makes music for your eyes. The idea that this could be played as a jazz. Those are all denotations that are coming from the connotations of the semiotics. So once again, you're not going to be able to cover all of this in your paper. What I'm doing here is, in the true sense of creativity, trying to saturate you, like give you a whole lot of ideas. You will later on be editing these ideas. So these are just possible ideas you could use from the first test or the first part of what we talked about. And I'm hoping your visual literacy has gotten really, really good so that you can understand some of this. There will be one more recording for you where I'm going to briefly talk about the history that is happening around this time, the context of Russia during this time. Because I've spoken about the Tsar and the Tsarina, and I've talked about the conflict in Russia at the time. And, if you're kind of hazy on that, it might be a little difficult. So this is the part 2. There'll be a part 3. And then apparently we've learned a lot about this painting on our way through the first test. Okay? Sound good? Good.